Il a aussi insulté tous les Africains.
Je crois qu'on a oublié de nous dire merci. C'est pas grave, ça viendra avec le temps.
Il y a une partie qui a retenu mon attention, là où il parlait d'ingratitude.
L'ingratitude, je suis bien placé pour le savoir, c'est une maladie non transmissible à l'homme.
In the endless list of men the West brands as enemies, most wear turbans, carry rifles, or command armies, but the one man America truly fears wears dusty boots, a military uniform, and walks freely among his people. His name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and he doesn't fit their enemy profile. He doesn't threaten to nuke anyone. He doesn't sit on trillions of barrels of oil. He doesn't even want to fight the West. He simply wants nothing from them. That's what terrifies them. But why exactly? Why is he the most feared man in the West? Let's uncover what the West will never confess. In the global economy, no resource has enslaved and enriched more than gold. It glitters in vaults and symbols. But in Africa, it has always served a different purpose: control. For over a century, Burkina Faso's gold was mined by its people, but never truly owned by them. The country's gold exited its soil faster than it could build schools or hospitals. It was extracted, exported, and refined in Europe, mostly in France and Switzerland, then sold on international markets, detached from the land and labor that produced it. Burkina Faso, despite being one of the continent's top gold producers, never had the power to set its price or even touch the final product. It was like being chained to a river of wealth that you could never drink from. Captain Ibrahim Traoré saw through this illusion. He recognized that until Burkina Faso could take ownership of what lay beneath its soil, every other form of sovereignty, political, financial, even cultural, would remain a performance. And so, in November 2023, with almost no Western media coverage and zero foreign sponsorship, he cut the first thread of the colonial web. He built a refinery, a real one capable of processing 400 kilograms of gold every single day, not for export in raw form, but for transformation on Burkinabe soil by Burkinabe engineers under Burkinabe law.
Première pierre, c'est une question de souveraineté d'abord. Dans l'environnement de la production d'or au Burkina, pendant longtemps on avait dit que nous n'étions pas un pays producteur d'or, mais depuis un certain temps l'or est devenu le premier produit d'exportation. Mais nous n'avons pas de contrôle sur l'or, que ce soit la recherche, la production, comme vous avez pu le voir, la raffinerie. Et nous nous sommes posés plein de questions et aujourd'hui nous avons décidé de mettre toute une chaîne en place.
To outsiders, it was just another infrastructure project, but in the minds of those who had long controlled African gold through offshore contracts and invisible margins, it was a declaration of war. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso didn't need to send its gold to France or Switzerland to realize its value. It didn't need to submit to contracts written in legalese that always favored foreign investors. It didn't need to wait for European buyers to dictate its economy. Traoré had cut out the middleman and the empire that stood behind him. The panic was quiet but unmistakable. Western mining companies began pulling out. Brokers in Dubai, Geneva, and Paris saw a freeze in the usual supply chain. Even global credit agencies responded with predictable punishment, downgrading Burkina Faso's ratings to high risk, signaling to investors to back off. Meanwhile, Burkinabe television showed the refinery working around the clock, pouring gold bars stamped with national insignia. In one televised segment, a refinery technician said, "This is the first time I've seen our gold stay in our hands." That statement carried more weight than any diplomatic speech ever could. But what truly shook the global system wasn't just that Burkina Faso was refining its gold. It was what that act represented. Because if gold, the most sacred of Western-controlled resources, could be seized back and processed locally, what else could be reclaimed? It wasn't just about metal, it was about imagination. Suddenly, the idea that Africa had to outsource everything, its wealth, its labor, its decision-making, was under fire. Traoré didn't just keep the gold, he stored it locally. He began shifting state reserves away from currencies like the CFA franc, still under the grip of the French treasury, and into gold bullion held within Burkinabe vaults. That meant the state's wealth could no longer be frozen by foreign courts, discounted by ratings agencies, or manipulated by sanctions. He was protecting not just the economy, but the very sovereignty of the state. Naturally, the attacks began, not against the refinery, but against the man behind it. Western publications questioned his leadership, his stability, and his legitimacy. He was portrayed as erratic, authoritarian, and untrustworthy. But the people of Burkina Faso saw something else, a leader doing what no one before him dared to do, touch what was always theirs. The refinery became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of reality. Traoré wasn't selling dreams. He was delivering gold, literally. Yet Traoré understood that gold, no matter how shiny, doesn't feed a nation. It can fund an economy, but it can't grow roots in the ground. It can buy food, but it can't guarantee that the next generation will know how to produce it. He knew that true sovereignty doesn't come from what's under the soil, but what grows from it. And so, once the gold began staying home, he turned his attention to something even more foundational: the right to feed his people with their own hands. When a nation takes control of its gold, it changes how it looks at everything else. If you no longer need to ship wealth to Europe to validate it, then you start asking harder questions. Why do we still import food? Why do we rely on foreign canned goods when we grow the ingredients ourselves? Why are our fertile fields full of poverty? Ibrahim Traoré didn't see the refinery as an endpoint. He saw it as a starting point, the down payment on a broader vision. Because what good is gold if you can't feed your people? What's the value of economic sovereignty if hunger still dictates your dependency? Burkina Faso is no stranger to farming. Its population is overwhelmingly rural, and agriculture makes up a huge share of its GDP. But like many African nations, it was stuck in a tragic contradiction. A food-producing country that couldn't feed itself. Tomatoes were grown locally, but pasta sauce came from Italy. Cashew trees bloomed in the thousands, yet the fruit rotted in silence while imported juices flooded local stores. Farming wasn't absent. It was undervalued, unprocessed, and unprotected. Traoré's plan wasn't just to grow more, it was to intervene at the choke point: processing. If Burkina Faso could refine its gold, then it could also process its harvests. And that's exactly where he struck next. In early 2024, the government launched an $8.9 million tomato processing plant in Yako. Unlike past attempts at agricultural reform, this was not designed with European aid or UN grants. It was funded through local state budgets and gold-backed reserves. The factory was built not just to absorb tomatoes, but to build market insulation, to end reliance on Italian canned goods that filled local shelves. It was engineered for Burkinabe consumption first, and then exported. The results were immediate. Tomato farmers, who once sold at a loss due to seasonal gluts, now had year-round demand. Women-run cooperatives began forming around storage and packaging, as local businesses found new buyers for local produce. By mid-2024, the factory had processed over 6,000 metric tons, cutting tomato imports by over 40% within its first season of operation. But Traoré wasn't finished. His next target was a product so overlooked it had become invisible: cashew apples. While the world fights over cashew nuts, the apple, the fleshy fruit that encases the seed, is often discarded. In Burkina Faso, hundreds of thousands of cashew apples go to waste every year. Traoré saw a business where others saw garbage. So in May 2025, he broke ground on an $11.5 million cashew apple processing plant in Penny. The goal wasn't just to make juice, it was to tap into a forgotten source of vitamins, fermentable sugars, and industrial alcohol, and to make it profitable. The facility is projected to process 5,000 tons annually, turning agricultural waste into wine, vinegar, spirits, and medical-grade ethanol.
Burkina Faso's latest bet is on its cashew industry. Efforts to utilize its abundant cashew apples are already.
In traditional development thinking, food production ends at the harvest. In Traoré's model, that's where it begins. Processing, packaging, and exporting aren't Western privileges anymore. They're national rights. And these factories weren't just economic hubs. They became symbols, visible, tangible proof that Burkina Faso could manufacture not just survival, but dignity. What made these projects revolutionary wasn't just their funding or their purpose. It was their ideology. Traoré rejected the idea that Africa must feed others while starving itself. He rejected the old model where raw cashews go to India and tomato paste comes back from Europe. He wasn't chasing GDP growth, he was chasing functional autonomy. This shift also began transforming the nation's cultural psyche. Farmers who once viewed their labor as marginal began to see themselves as frontline defenders of national independence. School children toured the tomato factory on field trips. Journalists began reporting factory output alongside gold refinery numbers. Suddenly, agriculture was no longer the domain of forgotten peasants. It was part of the nation's power grid. But even food, Traoré knew, is vulnerable if money still flows through foreign-controlled banks. If farmers had to beg for foreign credit, then the sovereignty they built in the fields could still be hijacked in the vaults. Gold could fund growth, food could sustain it. But what about financing it? Once again, Traoré's logic kicked in. If you can refine your gold and feed your people, then you must also build a bank that serves them. After establishing physical control over Burkina Faso's gold and launching national food processing initiatives, he realized the next battle wasn't on the ground, it was in the banks. Because even if gold was held locally and crops were harvested efficiently, money, the medium that connects production to prosperity, was still dominated by outside forces. The Burkinabe farmer could plant a field, the Burkinabe miner could refine a bar of gold, but neither could get a loan without going through a system laced with strings. Western-backed commercial banks prioritized extractive industries and elite urban real estate, while neglecting the backbone of the economy, rural workers, small traders, and agricultural cooperatives. These weren't just financial blind spots, they were intentional choke points. Keep the lifelines narrow and you control what breathes. Traoré decided to build an oxygen tank. In late 2024, the government launched the Postal Bank of Burkina Faso, Banque Postale du Burkina Faso, a publicly owned institution with $25 million in founding capital, sourced entirely from the country's gold reserves and internal revenues. No World Bank loans, no IMF advisors, no foreign donors. It was by design a rejection of the belief that Africa must borrow to develop. The structure of the bank was radical for its simplicity. It operated through post offices, one of the few institutions with physical reach across the entire country. This allowed farmers in remote villages, informal vendors in border towns, and youth collectives in urban slums to access accounts, save money, and apply for credit without setting foot in a Western-style financial district. Credit wasn't determined by credit scores calculated in Zurich. It was determined by community lending networks, agricultural output, and local cooperative endorsements. The bank didn't reward speculation, it rewarded productivity. This, in essence, was sovereign banking for sovereign people. The ripple effects began immediately. Within 2 months of opening, the bank registered over 60,000 new account holders, most of whom had never previously accessed formal financial services. Microloans were issued not for consumption, but for expansion, to buy grain mills, to repair irrigation canals, to acquire farming tools, to buy packaging for tomatoes and cashew juice. Money wasn't exiting the country, it was circulating, growing more productive with each turn. Critics called it unsustainable. Western economists warned that without oversight from global financial institutions, the bank would become distorted by populist economics. But what they feared wasn't mismanagement. It was a success, because the postal bank had quietly performed the unthinkable. It had created a financial loop that didn't pass through Paris, Brussels, or Washington. And once Burkina Faso proved it could fund its small businesses, its factories, its food systems, it started asking the most dangerous question of all: what exactly is the IMF for? In parallel, Traoré's administration began tightening regulations on foreign banks. All remittances had to be declared. Tax evasion loopholes through Western branches were shut down. Mining companies were ordered to route payments through the national financial system. No more disappearing profits to offshore accounts. This wasn't just about keeping money in the country. It was about making sure it served the country. Perhaps most symbolically, the postal bank began issuing its internal bonds, backed by physical gold rather than future loans. In doing so, Traoré was quietly creating a parallel credit system, one that didn't rely on borrowing from colonial lenders but on real assets, produced and held domestically. And here's the secret the global system doesn't want Africa to learn. When you stop borrowing from them, they lose all leverage. No more structural adjustment programs. No more austerity recommendations. No more currency devaluations imposed by foreign bureaucrats. Burkina Faso had broken the rules and stayed standing. But Traoré knew money was only one part of the story. Because even if your banks are free, you're never truly sovereign if your security still depends on foreign boots. Financial independence means little if someone else is flying drones over your borders. And so, with gold in vaults, food in factories, and money in the hands of the people, Traoré turned to the final frontier of autonomy: defense. The time had come to expel not just economic parasites, but foreign armies themselves. And remember, that's where the Western hate for Traoré turns into fear. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When a nation starts building a financial system it owns, the first question its enemies ask is, who's going to protect it? That question isn't rhetorical. In Africa, the answer has always been the same: foreign troops. U.S. drones patrol from above. French special forces patrol from within. Intelligence flows through NATO command centers, not national ministries. And when an African government resists too loudly, those same boots that claim to protect will be the first ones stomping on its sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré understood this from the start. That's why he didn't stop at gold, food, or banking. Because the truth is simple: if you don't control your security, you don't control anything. Your economy can be sabotaged, your elections manipulated, your leaders targeted, all under the guise of cooperation. And so, while international analysts were busy dissecting his economic decisions, Traoré was quietly preparing for a much louder one. In early 2024, after months of classified consultations with military command, Traoré made the decision that would redefine Burkina Faso's geopolitical posture. He ordered the complete withdrawal of all foreign troops, French, European, and American, from Burkinabe soil. This wasn't symbolic. It was operational. Air bases were shut down. Joint operations were canceled. Embassies were informed that intelligence cooperation was no longer on the table unless it was bilateral and transparent. Overnight, Burkina Faso became the only country in the Sahel actively refusing Western military protection. What followed was a wave of international condemnation dressed in diplomatic language. The French Foreign Ministry called it short-sighted. NATO officials warned of a security vacuum. US outlets declared that Traoré was risking regional stability. But beneath the noise was an unmistakable tone of panic. Because in one move, Traoré had exposed the myth that foreign soldiers were there for protection. The numbers told the truth. Despite 2 decades of Western military presence, insurgency in Burkina Faso had increased by over 200%. Drone strikes created more refugees than they eliminated threats. Local fighters adapted faster than international forces could strategize. And worst of all, villages began reporting that supposed counterinsurgency operations had destroyed farms, homes, and water supplies without ever identifying real insurgents. In many cases, the Western presence wasn't solving violence, it was multiplying. Traoré flipped the narrative. He declared that Burkina Faso would no longer outsource its right to exist. In a televised address to the nation, he said, "No nation can be sovereign while another's soldiers occupy its territory. We do not want to be guarded. We want to be respected." And then he acted. Within weeks, he announced the expansion of a national defense restructuring plan, recruiting 10,000 additional local troops with full integration into community service. These were not elite forces parachuted in for photo ops. They were citizens, farmers, welders, teachers, given military training and embedded in their regions. Even more radical, Traoré converted several military bases into dual-use service centers. Soldiers were ordered to help build roads, dig irrigation canals, repair schools, and distribute food alongside their defense roles. The army was no longer a colonial residue. It was being reborn as an institution of service, not occupation. For external defense, Traoré began aligning closely with regional neighbors, particularly Mali and Niger, forming the core of what would soon be known as the Alliance of Sahel States (AES), a regional bloc with real-time intelligence sharing, joint patrols, and combined strategy planning. No American generals, no French oversight, just Sahelian soldiers deciding how to defend Sahelian soil. Behind the scenes, new procurement contracts were negotiated. Burkina Faso began diversifying its sources of military equipment, seeking deals with countries like Turkey, Iran, Russia, and even China, not to build dependency, but to break the monopoly. No more single points of control, no more arms that come with advisors who sit in your command chain. But the most crucial shift was philosophical. For the first time in modern Burkinabe history, security was seen as an extension of national dignity, not vulnerability. Traoré didn't pretend that Burkina Faso was safe. He knew the threats were real, but he also knew that people cannot be truly secure until they believe they're worth protecting with their own hands. And once you reclaim the military, the final lever of outside control, there is only one front left to liberate: the mind. Because even if the gold is yours, the food is local, the banks are free, and the soldiers are home, what happens when your children still think in French, eat imported wheat, and dream of being Western? That's the final battlefield Traoré was preparing to face. You can win the gold, you can grow the food, you can fund your development, you can even reclaim your military. But if your people still think in the language of their colonizers, still dream of escaping to Europe, and still trust foreign knowledge over their own, then you've won the land, but lost the mind. And Ibrahim Traoré knows that losing the mind is losing everything. That's why, after reasserting control over Burkina Faso's resources, institutions, and army, he opened a new front. One far more dangerous, far less visible, but infinitely more powerful: the cultural battlefield. Because the average Burkinabe child still learns French, they still sing European nursery rhymes, memorize European history, and grow up thinking that real success means leaving Africa. Identity, for generations, has been outsourced, quietly, systematically, and intentionally. And as Traoré has repeatedly warned, no people can be free if their soul belongs to someone else. So in 2025, he launched the most radical, and perhaps most underestimated, phase of his national revolution: cultural decolonization. The first target was language. Traoré ordered a sweeping overhaul of the national education curriculum, mandating that primary school instruction in rural areas be conducted in local languages like Moore, Dioula, Fulfulde, and others, not French. The policy was more than linguistic. It was a direct assault on the idea that knowledge only counts if it's spoken in European tones. Critics inside and outside the country warned of fragmentation, of educational decline, of international isolation. But the results told a different story. Student attendance in rural schools shot up. Literacy improved. Young children who once sat silently in classrooms, ashamed or confused by French, now spoke, debated, and learned with pride. Parents, for the first time in decades, could understand what their children were learning. Whole communities became classrooms, and the classroom became a cultural revival ground. Language, it turned out, wasn't just about communication. It was about ownership of thought. But Traoré didn't stop with language. He turned to agriculture, not as an economic sector, but as a spiritual archive. He banned GMO seeds and terminated contracts with foreign agro-tech firms pushing modified crops. In their place, he introduced a national seed sovereignty program. Old seed banks were reopened. Indigenous farming techniques, passed down orally for centuries, were documented, taught, and integrated into formal agricultural universities. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a war against a system that had convinced African farmers that only imported seeds could feed their people. Traoré was out to destroy that myth. And he did it by fusing ancestral wisdom with modern science. His administration invested in agroecology programs, trained thousands of youth in organic farming techniques, and linked cultural festivals to seasonal farming cycles. In villages where knowledge had been dismissed as superstition, farmers now proudly taught professors how their ancestors rotated soil, tracked rain patterns, and preserved crops, all without chemical inputs. Where Western aid had once reduced farmers to passive recipients, Traoré's policies turned them into custodians of national memory. And perhaps the boldest move of all came with the National Arts Campaign. In 2025, the government launched a program funding local filmmakers, poets, musicians, and visual artists, but with one condition: no mimicry of Western tropes. Art had to be rooted in Burkinabe identity, language, and experience. The goal was not to entertain, it was to restore. Youth competitions were held for storytelling in indigenous languages. Rural radio stations began broadcasting traditional music fused with modern beats. Street murals in Ouagadougou exploded with symbols of pre-colonial resistance. A new wave of cultural nationalism swept across the country, not imposed from above, but emerging organically, because Traoré had permitted it to exist again. And the effect wasn't limited to Burkina Faso. Students in Senegal started requesting Wolof language history books. Artists in Niger painted tributes to local heroes, not foreign icons. WhatsApp groups across the Sahel began sharing Traoré's speeches translated into local dialects. Burkina Faso wasn't exporting products anymore. It was exporting confidence. But as Traoré rearmed the African mind with its voice, he knew one thing remained vulnerable, something every empire uses when it can no longer dominate you with guns, loans, or ideas. That weapon is isolation. And to defeat it, you don't build tanks, you build alliances. Especially after doing all this and knowing the Western hate toward Traoré, the alliance is needed. Traoré also knew, once you've reclaimed your gold, your food, your banks, your army, and even your mind, the next attack doesn't come with bullets or sanctions. It comes with silence. This is the West's final weapon: isolation. They won't invade you outright. They won't admit defeat. They'll just quietly erase you. You'll be left off conference lists. Your flights won't get clearance. Your leaders won't get invited. Your journalists won't get quoted. And slowly, the world stops seeing you, even as you rise. Ibrahim Traoré understood this game. He knew that once a country gains real sovereignty, it also becomes radioactive in the eyes of the empire. The moment Burkina Faso rejected France, refined its gold, built its banks, fed its people, and revived its own culture, it became a dangerous example, not because of weapons, but because of ideas that could spread. And so, before they could isolate him, he did something the West didn't expect. He multiplied. In 2023, Traoré helped launch the Alliance of Sahel States AES, alongside Mali's Assimi Goïta and Niger's Abdourahmane Tiani, three military leaders who shared one thing in common. They were done with France, done with the IMF, and done with neo-colonialism disguised as aid. But AES was never just a defensive agreement. It was a preemptive vision, a shield against isolation, and a sword against dependency. At its core, AES declared three bold, silent truths. We will defend each other like one body. We will speak with one voice. We will not kneel. By early 2025, that alliance was no longer an idea. It had become an infrastructure. Troop movements were synchronized. Intelligence sharing was encrypted and shared without intermediaries. Training exercises took place in French-free zones. Military drills were conducted in deserts that, just a year prior, were patrolled by NATO drones. Most importantly, Traoré and his AES counterparts didn't ask permission from ECOWAS, the African Union, or the United Nations. They didn't need to. This rejection of existing institutions wasn't random. It was rooted in betrayal. ECOWAS had threatened military action against Niger. The AU remained silent when French forces overstayed mandates. The UN passed resolutions, but never imposed consequences for decades of looting, destabilization, or exploitation. Traoré didn't want allies who would clap politely from New York. He wanted allies who would bleed with him in the Sahel. That's why, in March 2025, AES invited Togo and Guinea to join its growing coalition. Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya, himself a champion of mining sovereignty, responded with full support, calling AES the most honest structure in modern African defense. The West saw it differently. A leaked State Department cable, exposed by a whistleblower in April 2025, labeled AES as a strategic threat to the liberal order in West Africa, and warned that containment mechanisms may require escalation beyond diplomatic means. Translation: this alliance scares them because it's not just military, it's psychological. For decades, West Africa was seen as fragmented, weak, and permanently dependent. AES turned that script upside down, and fast. For the first time, African nations had a defense pact that didn't report to Brussels or Langley. For the first time, an African bloc existed that wasn't built by donors, but by defectors. And the cooperation wasn't just about soldiers. AES countries began discussing shared currencies based on gold, joint infrastructure investments like rail links, and even a regional communications network, independent of European satellites. There were talks of creating an AES central bank, backed not by debt but by hard assets and cooperative lending. These weren't fantasies, they were frameworks. And as the alliance grew stronger, the attacks grew louder. Western media painted it as a military junta club. Analysts questioned their democratic credentials. Think tanks warned of growing Russian and Chinese influence. But all these narratives missed the point. Traoré wasn't trying to emulate Moscow or Beijing. He was trying to redefine Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry as centers of power in their own right. Places that didn't have to orbit anyone, west or east, because AES is not about rivalry. It's about refusal. Refusal to be ruled, refusal to be divided, refusal to be erased. And once that refusal becomes regional, once your neighbors protect your back and amplify your voice, you're no longer vulnerable, you're unignorable. So, everything we've explored, from gold sovereignty to food security, from financial independence to youth awakening, points toward one unavoidable conclusion. The West's fear and hatred of Ibrahim Traoré is not emotional, accidental, or irrational. It is deeply strategic. You see, nations like the United States, France, and their institutional arms don't act based on feelings. They act based on patterns. When they see someone disrupting the structures they've spent decades, sometimes centuries, building in Africa, they recognize the threat immediately. And when that person is not a temporary dissident, but a disciplined architect of a new model, their fear turns into hostility. In the end, this is not just about one country or one leader. It's about the larger question his story forces the world to ask. What happens when an African nation finally decides it doesn't need the West, and then proves it? That, more than anything else, is why they hate him. And that, more than anything else, is why the rest of us should pay attention. Because if Burkina Faso, landlocked, sanctioned, underestimated, can break free, then the rest of the continent can too. And that's what they fear the most. Do you think Traoré is under threat? Would locals let the West hurt him? Let us know in the comment section. Has Burkina Faso woken up? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here, we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.